Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to talk about money laundering from the perspective of the FATF Secretariat. Why is it that after so many years, so much activity, so much money spent, so much money laundered, that we are failing to stem the tide of money laundering? And what is the role of the FATF in all of this? Well, let's start with some numbers. How much money is laundered? 1 to 3 trillion, 4.5 trillion, $6 trillion. Then there's the cost for banks. One estimate puts this at $180 billion a year. Let's pause here for a minute. In the several years I was head of AML policy for the UK, not once was I asked by ministers what can be done to stop money laundering. But what I was frequently asked was about the burden on business of regulations and the difficulties for customers to open bank accounts. My colleagues in finance ministries around the world shared that experience. This tells you a lot. The cost for business is important, but on the one hand, it is a function of the size and nature of the business being done. And on the other hand, it is not the question you should start with if your goal is to stop money laundering. Then there's the value of the assets recovered, often put at less than 1% of the proceeds of crime. So the context for this discussion is a $1 trillion problem, costing banks hundreds of billions, causing ministers to worry mostly about the burden of regulation and recovering less than 1% of the proceeds of crime. Hence, it's often said the system doesn't work, is broken, is at end of life, and is in need of reform. While this is a gross oversimplification, it is helpful in drawing attention to the need for action and to do something different in order to achieve a different result. We all know the definition of madness. But before turning to that, let's step back a bit. I often highlight the need for action, but I also draw attention to the fact that 30 years ago, money laundering was not even a crime in most countries. With little knowledge or action to tackle it, very few investigations. Today, most countries not only criminalise money laundering and terrorist financing, but they've built a whole legal and operational framework around this. And many are starting to understand the risks they face and to use this framework to get results. There are successful investigations and prosecutions every day around the world. We've gone from no activity to a lot of activity. And while much of it should be better targeted, there are many examples of success every day. So what about the FATF? Many argue it's a closed shop of unaccountable bureaucrats pushing a broken system. And I can see why, though I don't agree. If nothing else, it's an inclusive forum, not only for its 39 member countries, but representatives of 205 jurisdictions and 20 international organisations, from the UN to Interpol and the Egmont group of FIUs. In fact, it's so inclusive that more jurisdictions are represented in its meetings than in the UN General Assembly. And while the final decision on the text of standards is made by only 39 countries, representatives of many more are active and influential in the development of standards. I would argue this is much more effective and more inclusive than other bodies with perceived greater legitimacy, including UN bodies where similar decisions are taken, such as the Security Council. If you want to address a global problem, you need everyone in the room, and you need to get agreement among as many of them as possible. At its core, that is what the FATF is and does. So is the FATF a closed shop? I'd say no. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement. There is a need for better engagement, not just with the private sector, but with academia, as well as the need to give smaller, developing nations around the world a greater voice in decision making. But what about the claim that FATF is pushing a broken system? Most of the criticism I see is directed at the way in which regulators supervise and the impact this has on the banks. And this is where there is alignment. FATF evaluation shows supervision is largely ineffective in 2/3 of countries, and that preventive measures are largely ineffective everywhere. Of course, this hides an increasing amount of goodwill and effort by many. But interestingly, it's the others, lawyers, accountants, company formation agents among them, that almost certainly are a bigger problem than we care to know about. They are not given enough attention in FATF evaluations, and governments are not held to account for ignoring the problem. So, FATF is a necessary forum, and it is not only pushing the same agenda as some of its critics, but it is the most evidence-based source of that criticism. And it provides concrete recommendations for action through its standards and evaluations. Assuming there is value in that, what is it that needs to change? Well, part of this is a matter of time. Systemic improvements and an impact on a problem this big, not just passing new regulations, takes time. You might say countries have had 30 years already. However, the focus on impact or effectiveness only started in earnest 8 years ago, and many countries still haven't been assessed yet. A single evaluation takes 14 months, and a single successful money laundering investigation can take years. So it does take time, many years, to see real and sustained improvements across the whole system in a country, let alone globally. In the meantime, what else can be done? Action on money laundering ebbs and flows with events. We see bursts of activity around the timing of FATF evaluations, following terrorist attacks, regulatory action, or investigative journalism like the Panama Papers. We rarely see consistent commitment. That's why we need to do a better job of explaining why money laundering is important. And that's why at the FATF Secretariat, we focus our media activity on explaining why we do what we do and why it's important people care about this. For me, it's about reducing the harm caused by crime and terrorism. Yes, there are benefits of financial transparency and protecting the integrity of the financial system. And yes, there are benefits too for establishing trust in business, in national economies, and sustainable and economic growth. But that's not what gets me out of bed in the morning. What gets me up every day is the hope that by stopping money laundering, we save lives. We protect people and society from the harms of drug abuse, girls from being trafficked for sex, and our wildlife and environment being destroyed for profit. Money laundering wasn't a crime until we made it one. It's not murder, it's a crime we invented. And why did we invent it? So we could follow the money to take the profit out of crime. It sounds simple, but reconnecting to the underlying harms of money laundering and the purpose of AML, going back to basics, ensuring everyone understands the importance of stopping it, is critical and has been overlooked for too long. What else can be done? This is where what the FATF calls for aligns increasingly with what others are calling for, and I'll focus on just 3 of these things. Firstly, we need a more joined-up approach between law enforcement and banks, and we need to see better public-private collaboration and more public-private partnerships. These should expand across borders and enable a more dynamic assessment of risk and prioritization of effort. We need not only a risk-based approach, but we need an intelligence-led approach. And this means more specific information, actionable intelligence being shared by the authorities. And it means sharing information in a way that protects privacy and human rights and doesn't close down access to the financial system. Secondly, we need to see better use of technology for smarter, not just more efficient, but more effective action. Earlier this year, the FATF published 2 papers on the use of technology for AML, which supports this. And I encourage you to read those reports available on the FATF website. And thirdly, and as called for by the Wolfsburg Group, banks should be incentivized and rewarded by supervisors for providing really useful information to the police and not just ticking the boxes for the sake of regulatory compliance. Those are just a few of the things that can and need to be done. We started by talking about numbers. In 1989, the year the FATF was created, Time magazine ran with a front cover in big bold letters, "Money laundering, the $1 trillion shell game." You can be forgiven for thinking not a lot has changed. It's a problem that has led to banks alone spending hundreds of billions, costs undoubtedly picked up by us all, and pushing demand for alternative, cheaper, easier, but also riskier ways for people to send and receive money around the world. It's a problem that leaders in most countries still don't properly understand and so are not genuinely motivated to act upon. And yes, there's a cost to dealing with this problem, but we rarely consider the real cost of not doing so. I would argue we can make a great start by better allocating current resources. The investment being made is all in the wrong places. Banks monitoring every transaction, regardless of risk, priority or intelligence. and FIUs struggling to keep records of millions of suspicious transaction reports in Excel spreadsheets? What if a fraction of the investment made was directed towards the authorities for analysis, investigation, and dissemination of actionable intelligence to law enforcement? And what if more people were not fined, but, as Jeffrey Robinson so eloquently puts it, they're put in a cell for 10 years with a guy named Billy the Blade who's got 2 fang tattoos on the side of his neck? And then there has to be a wider recognition that good AML practice by businesses can help stop crime and terrorism. And whether it does or not, it's just good business sense and protects business. There is a chasm between what the FATF recommends, what governments do, what the police are able to do, what regulators do, and real-world implementation by firms. But the opportunity for change and impact today is bigger than ever. Today, this is less about global standards, and it's certainly not about ticking boxes, screening everything, and regulators taking a zero-tolerance approach. It's about creating the space necessary for innovation and collaboration, and accepting that we won't catch or stop everything. If you work in AML, the opportunity to make a difference has never been greater. While there's crime, there'll be money laundering, but we can do so much better, and I hope I've given an insight into how. Thanks for listening, and I hope that next year we can all be back together in person in Cambridge.